Welcome to Boomer Has It. I'm JB Miller in London.
And I'm Jim Jalamas back in Brooklyn. Hello, everyone.
Glad to have you back in Brooklyn. Jim, we're going to talk today about the counterculture. Where is it? And I think this is an issue that is particularly interest to we boomers, us boomers, because we remember the counterculture from the 60s. And if you Google counterculture, they reference the 60s as if there hasn't been one since then. So is this a term that's just outdated? Is there something like a counterculture, but it's not called a counterculture? What's going on?
You know, when you say counterculture to me, I just think it's like a cute headline for a food column. So that's how out of the way this concept has become, since people of a certain age remember a distinct counterculture in this country that had a look, a sound, a style, it had art, it had poetry, it had a language of all its own. So maybe we start by saying, what is a counterculture? What does it mean,
We
be in a
have to explain
counterculture?
what this is. I mean, to what you just said, I Googled counterculture, and one of the first things that came up was counterculture drinks. Instantly commodifying a very non-commercial concept. So that's the generation we're living in, or that's the era we're living in. What is the tell us what the counterculture is or was.
think I think we start at the very basics. A counterculture is people, just like Soylent Green, right? But they're living people, and they have an
There's a
affinity.
boomer reference, Soylent Green. All right. That dates
They
you right
yeah,
there.
they're alive. They're alive, and they
Yeah.
have they coalesce around discontent or protest or rebellion. And as they do that, they take on a language of their own, a look on of their own, and again, probably the most obvious one was the 60s counterculture that coalesced around the Vietnam War and the civil rights movement and um,
All the rights movement,
Eisenhower
you know,
Eisenhower era people.
yeah, there was gay rights, women's rights, there were all of these groups of people fighting for their rights. But yes, against the backdrop of the Vietnam War, which was a truly generational divide, which we don't have anymore, right? We have a more geographical divide, a demographic divide, but not a generational divide. The Vietnam War was a generational divide because it was the older generation who had instigated it and were running it, and the young men who were forced to fight it. And you could easily be drafted and killed for a war that you didn't believe in or even understood why it was being fought. So that was a really serious, that was a life or death issue, which was the backdrop part of the backdrop to the counterculture. But yes, also just the generational divide of the Eisenhower years being very conformist, right? And
That's the right word, right?
quite
It was
conservative.
anti-conformist. It was a big part of that movement. But I was thinking, we were talking about Mad Magazine the other day, and I remember
Yeah.
William Gaines, the editor. I didn't know what was happening behind the scenes. I only knew Alfred E. Newman and the parodies that I saw inside the magazine and the comics. But I remember years as I got a little older, I saw the editor, William Gaines. He's kind of a scion of the publishing business,
Yeah.
comic book publishing. His father, yeah, his father was a founder of EC Comics, I believe, and but he had long hair and a big beard. You could dress your vote. The way you looked sort of described what side you were on. If you had long
Yes.
hair and
Hair was
beard,
a major thing. It was the name of a rock and roll musical. That's how instantly that how would that phenomenon exerted itself. If you had long hair, it was uh, it was saying something, wasn't it? It was sort of
it was like your call. It was yeah. It was like you were a card carrying member of the counterculture by what you wore and what your hair looked like.
yes.
Although I have to argue, but by the time they released Hair on Broadway, those songs and the way they depicted the counterculture was kind of a parody of it. By that time it was
Yeah, I guess it
more
took
or
a
less
while.
over.
But
Yeah.
that musical came out, I think, in 1960 7? I mean, it was pretty
Was it
early. But
67? Is
it
that right?
ran so long, it was such a success that it kind of became a victim of its own success. We should mention, though, that there it didn't take much to be it's initially in the mid-60s, you could have hair over your ears if you were a guy, and that was considered being, long-haired. If you look at the Beatles covers from the Beatles, record covers from, like, the mid-60s, Rubber Soul, their hair didn't look that long to us now, but that was that was considered outrageous for its time. "Get a haircut, for God's sakes. Young man, get a haircut." And, then the hair just getting long. I remember when by the time the White Album came out, John Lennon had hair down to here, well over his ears, down to his shoulders, and that was truly hippie hair. But yes, it was a sign of where you were in the counterculture. We don't have signs like that anymore, except for the signs you hold up when you're at a protest, literal signs. But we don't have visual, or do we? I was concerned that a friend of mine who I think is left of center, progressive, this was here in England, seemed to have had a sort of Nazi haircut. He had the shaved side of the head. It looked like something out of the Hitler Youth. And I thought, oh my God, that's a terrible look.
Well,
Do you
the
know what
thing
I'm
about the
talking
hair
about?
is, the hair, you couldn't code switch the hair. If you were talking with your grandparents or you were going to get a job, your hair was your hair, and you couldn't, code switching is a term that, people of color use when they want
What does
to.
that mean, code switching?
It means you sort of adapt to the audience you're speaking with. So you might talk a little more formally when you're with just all white people or in a business setting. And to some degree, we all code switch. All of us do it. But when you're part of an oppressed society or oppressed segment of society, if you don't code switch, you could be insulted, you could be harmed, beaten up, fired from your job, or killed. So
All right,
but in those
yes.
days, you couldn't cut your hair when you have talking to your Aunt Ethel, you know? You wore your hair the way it was. It was kind of a brave statement. And I
Yeah.
remember there was a counterculture in Greece in the 1960s to protest the junta. And when the police came to contain the crowds, they had scissors and they would grab protesters and cut their hair. They would cut locks of hair. So hair was a
Hair
pretty
was a big
potent
thing.
symbol
Yeah, it
in
was
a
a
certain
symbol.
counterculture.
It really
Now,
was.
I'm gonna throw a curveball at you, Mr.
All
Miller.
right.
You ready for this one?
I'm ready. I'm ready for it.
Batten down the hatches, boomer boy. I would argue that MAGA is a counterculture,
Ooh, oh my
or
god. All right.
was a counterculture.
Well, the tea, what was it called? Now I can't remember
Tea
the the
Party.
the Tea Party. Remember the Tea Party? That was a forerunner of MAGA. The Tea Party was kind of a the initial, was that the initial right-wing counterculture?
Yeah, it came out of it came out of around the Obama inauguration, right? It was a
Yes.
Tea Party protest,
Yeah.
very thinly veiled racism.
Yeah, the Tea
Um,
Party.
but But I think they coalesced into what's MAGA today. And,
Mm.
if you think about it, I mean, some of the countercultures of the '60s, they had conspiracies. And so enter QAnon, and that makes MAGA a perfect counterculture because these are people with perceived grievances,
But I
real,
but
imagined.
how can the followers of the president be a counterculture? This is by definition, the establishment. Your guys are in the White House, your guys are running Congress, your guys are running the Supreme Court. How is that a counterculture? That's the culture.
I said it was a counterculture.
So what does it become?
Now it's become, I don't know, it's become the party in power,
Ruling
you know,
class.
the ruling class. I think that I know it's interesting. There's a much talked about percentage called the 3.5 percentage rule. Do you know you're familiar with that by a
What's
woman
that?
and a scholar named Chenoweth, Erica Chenoweth, and she researched political movements from 1900 to 2006 and determined that the most successful political movements are peaceful and they're successful when they achieve 3.5% of the
Yes,
population,
I have read about yes, that's the
which is in the US is 12 million.
so you're saying if so yes, I read somewhere that if that number of people are seen marching on the streets, then that's a sort of tipping point. Is that true?
It's the peak. At when that number reaches peak, it becomes successful generally.
Have we reached that point? And is that the counterculture? Is that because when I talk about the counterculture, I think about it in cultural terms more than political terms. And if you go back to the 60s, you can find the sort of signifiers, the representatives of the counterculture in literature and in film, and mostly in music, because it was the music that was really guiding and directing the counterculture. Music was so important in the 60s and the early 70s, and that was where the young people like us then found our voice or recognized our voice in lyrics and the music of the time. But we also had writers like Kurt Vonnegut and Joe Heller and Richard Brodigan, who else, and films like Bonnie and Clyde and The Graduate. The Graduate was, a major cultural moment in the six
Well, you're leaving out one major film that really energized the counterculture, which was Easy Rider.
Easy Rider, absolutely. Easy Rider, terrible film, but had a huge impact at the time.
I
And
have to agree, it was a pretty terrible
a
film,
terrible movie is
but
not
it
is
had
not
hair,
aged
it
well.
had motorcycles, it had Jack Nicholson,
Jack Nicholson, Dennis Hopper, and Fonda. Which Fonda was it?
Peter.
Peter Fonda.
Actually, that's perfect example because they have long hair and they're traveling through a southern community and they're attacked for their hair, more or
They
less,
are, yes, yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I
without
think
giving too much away.
don't give away the ending, but it was a recognizable generational divide that was explored in that film, which was made on a nothing budget and ended up grossing something like $100 million. It confused and scared Hollywood that didn't know what was going on, didn't know how to find their, audience. They were making hugely expensive, musicals with Julie Andrews, and they're losing millions hand over fist. So yeah, movies, there were certain films, certain books, and a lot of music that really represented a counterculture. And they were not all instigated or created by young people. Kurt Vonnegut was a World War II veteran, as was, Joe Heller. These were older people that were adopted as representatives of the counterculture by young people. Robert Altman was not a young filmmaker when he made MASH, which was a hugely important film at the time. He was probably already in his 40s or 50s with a huge career behind him, but he just made a film that just struck a chord with the younger generation. A film that was about the Korean War, set in the Korean War, but was really about the Vietnam War.
Or generally an anti-war film,
It was,
which,
yeah.
by the way, I think both of us recently watched it, and it does not age well at
Well, because of
all.
the sex, it's so sexist. I think that's what jumped out at me was how incredibly sexist and I think misogynist, but
And
I was
racist.
disappointed.
And
And
racist.
well, yeah, racist, sex,
Yeah.
misogynist. Not a good look for a film, but
It's almost as if the humanistic sentiment of the film, not necessarily the characters, excuse them all from very bad behavior
yeah,
overall.
yes, I think that's true. It's a problematic film, which I would encourage people to watch and contextualize from its time. I wouldn't dissuade anyone from watching anything really, as long as you contextualize it and.
Did you just say contextualize?
I
Is
think I
that
said it
German?
twice.
Is that a German word?
Contextualize. So where is
Schadenfreude,
it? Where
Sauerbraten. Please continue.
Schadenfreude. Where was the counterculture? See, Oh, yeah. No, I wanna bring something else in when this is again dating us, but we're already self-avowed boomers. In 1980, when Ronald Reagan got elected, I was hugely disappointed, but I said, "Well, I thought at least there'll be the silver lining that we'll get a counterculture," which you and I missed partly in the '60s. We were too young to be at Woodstock. We were too young for aspects of that culture. So I thought, great, I'm in my 20s, I'll be in the forefront, I'll be in the middle of a new counterculture. And it didn't happen. There was no real cultural pushback on Reagan, with, I think, one major exception, which was during the AIDS crisis and the ACT UP movement and the gay men's health
That's a
crisis
great that's
in
a
New York. We're a counterculture, and I thought they were, and we you were in New York then. I remember what a huge impact they had, culturally as well as politically, and the AIDS quilt, which was a memorial for all the people who died of AIDS. That was incredibly moving and a major art project, which
and what's interesting is it followed there around 1980, there had been a growing counterculture in the punk movement.
mm,
But to what
right.
end? I mean, in England, the punk
It was a
movement was
nihilistic
it
movement. It
was
was nihilism,
well, it was more than that, though. I think in England, it was a fashion movement, it was a musical movement, and behind it all was restlessness with lack of employment and feeling oppressed in the Thatcher years.
yeah, that's fair
And
enough. No,
in
no,
the US version of it was really just boredom, and it all just led to nihilism, and there wasn't much to it except for some great music. However,
which is
the
aged
AIDS
well. That music has aged well, I think. That music is
ACT
still
UP,
fresh. The Clash.
the AIDS movement,
Mm,
that was a pretty profound, and
yeah,
I would say also underappreciated. Uh, that the crisis has more or less passed. AIDS and HIV are still with us, but that was a successful movement, and it also it also brought in some interesting
it was a successful movement.
action, which was to out people. There were some AIDS activists were outing people, like Malcolm Forbes, for example. He founded Forbes magazine. He was a father of modern commerce,
I
speaking
thought that
out
was
for
Jodie
free
Foster was
market.
outed. I remember seeing posters, people put up on walls in New York. I'd see things about Jodie Foster being outed, and I thought, that's a darker side of this movement, I think. I think the feeling was a frustration over famous people who were in the closet who could make a difference if they came out to the gay rights movement. But it struck me as being unfortunate, and I thought people should, if people didn't want to be outed or didn't want to be out, that was
Yeah,
their prerogative.
it was kind of a splinter group, I would say.
Yeah, you're probably right.
It even created a magazine called Out
Out.
Magazine. Kind of obvious. A little bit on the nose there, but
And on the nose. Does that
it
have to
was
be
a
have to be the name? Can we call it Nice Friends Magazine? Friendly
uh,
Folks Magazine?
ex
Ouch, ouch,
closeted.
out with your magazine. Yes.
Yeah, a little obvious. Yeah, no, I mean, it was I think people in Hollywood and in, private business, public officials who are gay
Yeah.
were scared, and I don't know, I in some respects, I always thought, well, if these people were out, then it would be good for gay people everywhere, and they could make contributions by using their influence to accelerate research and a cure. Now that's today. Now you kind of like being out is a little bit like it's part of this full disclosure that's glorified in today in people in their 20s or
Yeah.
30s.
No, that's fair enough.
We disclose our sexuality, our gender, we disclose our health and
Yeah.
whether we're neurodivergent or not.
Yeah, well, we
Everything is out.
overshare. We also overshare on social media. But let's get back to the present, because I would argue we are living in through a period of history which is as extreme and dangerous as it was during the Vietnam War. And, really dire, dour moment politically in the US and in parts of Europe. And I would have thought there'd be more of a cultural counterculture. I don't need to use the word culture twice, a counterculture to meet this moment. And I am not seeing it. Or am I blind to it? What am I missing? Jim, tell me,
I
what am I
think
missing?
just hold your horses there, Miller.
All right.
I think it's still young and maturing. I mean, it's broken up into fragments. What we have seen as a counterculture has been the Gaza movement on college campuses over the years, which has been pretty much crushed by university officials, by the White House, ultimately
Yes,
by
by Trump.
Netanyahu, by ultimately by with the assistance of U.S. military facilities, has pretty much ended that whole conflict. Um,
I've seen
so
more.
so they're out there, but then they're environmentalists, and
Yeah, but
they're all coalescing.
why aren't there demonstrations on college campuses against Trump and this current administration? Gaza. Yes, I agree, that's a major issue. It's a country that's thousands of miles away. The White House is right in on the eastern coast. He may have tore down part of the White House, but which is obviously another symbol of what he's doing. But I mean, there's enough to protest in the US of the US and culturally where I think I see more of it in a way in a counterculture on the nightly what are here called chat shows on shows like Jimmy Kimmel and Stephen Colbert. I think are producing fantastic with their and their writers fantastic comedy about what's going on politically now, which is and a lot of young
I
people
see.
getting their news from this. They contextualize, to use that word again, what
Quit
they're doing.
speaking German.
Is that a
So
German
you're saying
word?
the counterculture
No, I'm sorry
exists?
to they always explain, what the news item is, and then they make jokes about it. So they're both informing their public and framing it in absurdist
So you're
terms.
saying the counterculture exists on late night television?
Yes, that's the only place I see it. I don't know where else it is. Where else is it? Tell me.
You know what? I think again, it's fragmented because what's coming at the population is are fragmented offenses. You might be concerned about tariffs, or you might consider the Federal Reserve. What about the Epstein files? Those are hard to connect with. Maybe the Epstein files would bring in a women's movement. You would think,
Yeah, you'd think.
but also it's hard. It's sort of hard to go out and protest the rule of law because it's so abstract. But you
Mhm.
know, it's not a united front. What I see when I go to observe protests and sometimes protest myself
No, you're
are
you're a foot soldier.
diverse interests,
Jim,
diverse
you are
interests.
seeing this firsthand. You're a foot soldier in this pushback, and I personally, you know, I appreciate that. I just wonder, you know, we are creative people, and it was clear when we were young that the creatives, to use a term that was not current 50 years ago, creatives of that period were creating art that was part of a of a counterculture that was commenting on the status quo. And I'm just not I just don't seem to be seeing it.
It well, and then the other thing is, when does counterculture become an active and successful movement? There's a little bit of a difference there, right? You're in a counterculture. What is its end, and when does it achieve success?
And
And
you could argue that
like I go back to, you can even go back, talk about art. I was just reading the New York Times. They had a literary quiz, and they referred to Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's poem about Paul Revere, and they managed to talk about Paul Revere creating an engraving that he stole from a young colleague, and it was a drawing of the Boston Massacre, and he, being a silversmith, could engrave copper very
Well, those
quickly.
are very famous prints. I mean, I'm from Massachusetts, and we
Right.
see
Well,
reproductions
he
of those prints everywhere. I think there are
people
4 of
might
them.
not know what might not know what an engraving is. It was a printing process. You would cut grooves into copper. The deeper the groove, the more ink and the darker the lines, and he created an engraving, the Boston Massacre, which is,
I didn't
you
realize
know,
he'd stolen those. Now I'm
and he
shocked.
stole them from a young colleague, because,
How
he
does this
was
relate to the counterculture?
it was greatest intellectual property theft of all time. But it relates because it was art. It was art that inflamed the senses and united sons of liberty,
Wow, you're giving us incredible history
like
lesson.
art did, like in the 1960s. I mean, think of the band posters that kind of all had that
Yeah.
look.
Well,
They had black
The
light
Fillmore East,
colors.
but I would I guess we should, confess that, the counterculture maybe failed in the '60s because it didn't stop the Vietnam War. And, the Vietnam War was finally ended in what, 1973? Years after the protest began, it ended, Nixon got reelected by a landslide. And even though he was brought down by the Watergate crisis, there was only a single term of Jimmy Carter. We only had 4 years of a Democratic administration between 1968 and 1992. Uh,
With a one-term president. Yeah,
One-term
that's
president.
right.
So, you could maybe argue that the counterculture failed and didn't bring about much change. Certainly in 1980 when Reagan won in almost something of a landslide, much more of a landslide in 1984 when he got reelected. I felt like the counterculture failed, and maybe that would explain why people felt
Well, what was
exhausted,
the
bruised.
how did the counterculture fail, though? I mean, Nixon took the country out of Vietnam. So, is that a failure, or
He
did you have higher ambition?
he took he got reelected. Remember there was sorry, we have to go into the murky fields of history here, but I mean, I it took a very long time. Johnson knew that he was losing the Vietnam War, so that would have been before 1968. He decided not to run for reelection. He felt completely battered and bruised by the anti-war movement. That didn't bring about the end of the Vietnam War. It brought a very right-wing Republican administration. It just totally, I don't know. You could argue it, but I don't think that
I would argue that the counterculture made the Vietnam, if anything, made the Vietnam War extremely unpopular and not politically tenable for Nixon. And yeah, there's a lot of
got
roundabout.
reelected.
ac-
I mean, I don't know.
it-
How untenable was it? It begat Nixon. We can argue this is again going to the weeds of history. There's 1968 Chicago Convention where I thought they demonstrated at the wrong convention because they assumed that whoever was the Democratic nominee would be the next president, and they wanted to send a message to end the Vietnam War, and it
Sure,
was so violent that it
sure.
ended up helping Nixon get elected.
Yep.
Anyway, that's a whole other people would get angry responses to that, saying that's not what caused the Nixon election. But anyway,
Well, that counterculture was a scattershot, I would say, coalescing around the war, but also the civil rights movement, gay rights, women's rights, the sexual revolution, the drug revolution. But I think its center point was the war, and because the war ended, it was successful. I mean, there weren't that many places to go, and by that time, members of Congress, they had hair past their ears and they had sideburns.
you're the
They had the look.
optimist. You're the optimist in this discussion because I seem to remember, and this might be from a New York Magazine cover, maybe an article by Tom Wolfe, who labeled the '70s the me generation, like the narcissistic generation. It was all about individuals at that point. And that was the sort of
That's
commercial,
right.
that was the sort of the beginning of is this a word? Commoditizing? I'm mispronouncing this.
You're
The
speaking German again.
commodification. Stop calling me German. The commodification of
I'm
everything maybe
sorry, Herr
started in the
Miller,
'70s.
Commandant.
I shall speak with a German accent from now on to make it sound more authentic. But no,
Did
the
Tom Wolfe coin that, the me
yes, I
generation?
think so. I think that was a Tom
Because
Wolfe article.
following that was a blockbuster book called The Culture of Narcissism
Yeah, there you go.
by Christopher Lasch, who
Okay,
traced narcissism to every aspect of US society, including the DH rule in Major League Baseball, which
and that was the
I had to
70s,
re
right? That
I
was
had to reread it over and over again to figure out how that was
God. So that
narcissistic.
was the heir to the 60s, was the 70s, the me generation, the culture of narcissism. And I think, the 1980s begat Reagan and Trump. Trump represented the 80s. If you lived in New York in the 90s, Trump represented the sort of gaudy new wealth, without taste. It was just, and, he was this buffoon. We didn't take him seriously, but he represented the narcissistic, moneyed, everything all about him generation.
Well, it's interesting because I think he coincides with um, another movement, not really a movement, but the yuppie movement, right? In a way, he was kind of the ultimate young urban professional. He lived in New York City. He had wealth. He had activity. He was making deals
Yeah,
and living well,
New York
right?
Magazine
So
was the
yeah.
house organization, the house magazine of the yuppies, don't you think? And I like New York Magazine. I'm not even trashing it, but it was caught that wave. And they loved, Trump was all over the place because he was funny. He was sort of, yeah, he was a buffoon, but he was,
And any opportunity he could get to be in front of a camera or in a
yeah.
magazine. I mean,
Oh yeah.
if you rewatch Sex and the City episodes, I think he makes 2 or 3
My
appearances,
God.
random appearances as sitting in the Oak Room at the Plaza
Oh
Hotel.
God. There
I
was
mean,
no
talk about
escape.
being
As a New
right, and then
Yorker, we were, yeah, we were aware of Trump
but also, I mean,
40
here we're
years.
going back. We're allowed to talk this way because that's sort of the theme of the podcast, but he had a very strange relationship with Spy magazine.
Yes.
If you
Yeah.
recall,
They coined the term the small-fingered vulgarian, I think. Wasn't that?
that was the term they had, and for
Yeah.
readers,
He
listeners
couldn't get
out
over
there,
it. He's the thinnest-skinned person ever. I mean, he can't.
but Spy magazine was I would call it a not really a satirical magazine. It was a sort of a commentary that had, I don't know, 5 good years and brought
Yeah.
out
I
some of
mean,
the best writers and
we could
editors
call it a
we know.
counterculture magazine. I mean, bring it back to our subject. Spy maybe was the counterculture in the 80s. I'd forgotten about Spy till you brought it up. But that's
Well,
good.
maybe just for the yuppie era. So, right, I think New York Magazine and Spy were sort of working in tandem to speak to an educated money class of younger
Yeah.
professional people. But these had other counterculture magazines that are, very obscure, or a music magazine, NME from England. What a great magazine that was
Oh,
if you
yeah.
like new
No,
music.
absolutely. Well, I want to get onto a few other things, but just, do you think there's room for a future counterculture? You're being much more optimistic than I am. So I want to hear it from you, from Jim Jalamas. I want Jim Jalamis's view on, will we have a counterculture? Do I have something to look forward to in that regard?
I think American society has to cleanse the remnants of MAGA right now. And this is something I was talking to you about before is, just the way the 60s counterculture had a look and a tone and a feel. So does the MAGA movement, especially the youth movement. And it's built around
Got
something
those
called
hats.
fash it's called fashwave. Called
Right. Yes, you
fashwave. And
mentioned,
it's right, it's graphics and video using this acid colored
but that's not the counterculture.
David Fincher palette. It uses shaky camera movements. It uses text that's called VHS typeface. And it's all derived from film and video games from the early and late 90s. But the sad punchline of that is that look, that metallic, grainy look, DHS is using it to recruit ICE and DHS agents. And
Right.
maybe that's the end. Maybe
You're
maybe
depressing
that's
me.
where
I was hoping
maybe
for some
that's where
optimism here.
maybe MAGA jumps the shark. Maybe this is where MAGA is
I hope
jumping the
so.
shark.
I'm waiting
But
for MAGA.
I've
I've
been
been
waiting
waiting
for
for MAGA
that
to
for a
jump the
long
shark for a
time.
while.
It would be nice if there was a counterculture movement around the victims of Epstein, because that's women who are
Yeah,
mistreated, including the botched release of the files, which redacted the men's
we
names,
can
but didn't
only
redact the women's names.
we can only hope that happens, and I certainly hope that happens. We're only, God knows, we're little over 1 year into this administration, Trump,
You
to,
know I've attended many protests, and I've told this story to everyone, about coming back after a protest and speaking to a barista at my cafe, my cheeks red from the cold, holding a sign, and they say, "Were you at a protest today? Was there a protest today?"
they weren't
And
aware
there's
of it.
it's a cross between, when you read about it, how protests are attended by people of a certain age, certain experience. It's a combination of hand wringing or just cold observation. And what does it mean that people who attend these protests, the everyday protests? I'm not talking about the massive no kings. I'm talking about the President's Day protest in front of Trump Tower, which I attended yesterday. Had about 300 people, fierce anti-MAGA people with coordinated raising of the middle finger. But it was people of a certain age. Some brought their children, many in the boomer era, and I just wonder, how is that going to change? And I think of myself when I do this that I'm doing it for other people. I'm doing it for people who have
People
jobs
in your
or
cafe, the barista
responsibilities.
show
People are people have jobs or families that it's not that convenient. Although,
Yeah,
the
alright.
story of Minneapolis is fascinating because that movement, that counterculture, if you can even call it that, that became a part of everyone's everyday lives. They
Yeah,
all owned 3M masks with the dual respirators. Everyone had
yeah,
that in their home.
yes,
It was part of their day,
and that
and
came together
I would
really, really
think you
quickly.
could argue that it was successful.
Alright, well, alright, well, that's fair enough,
You're
that's an
not arguing
interesting.
with me? You're not contextualizing?
I'm not gonna contextualize that, I think that's a good point. Listen, we have to wrap this up, but I just wanted to get to, some responses from our last episode, which was about, national treasures. I got a lot of lists from people of their own national treasures, and I got a lot of people thinking about this, and I really enjoyed that, but we had some criticism. One was somebody criticized my, portrayal of Henry Fonda's politics, saying that he was a famous liberal most of his life, and I had maligned him as a conservative. I was talking about the 1960s when he did become a conservative and supported the Vietnam War. And my point was that he represented a generational divide between himself and his very politicized children, Peter Fonda and Jane Fonda. But that's a fair point that he was a liberal during most of his life, his politics. We also had a criticism of my use of the term fair point, that I was using that term too much. And I can only respond to that that's a fair point. And also that we had maligned Mark Ruffalo and Susan Sarandon for their political activities when they were maybe a bit. Anyway, their hearts are in the right place. We applaud them for that, even if Mark Ruffalo got, what did he see? Get the name wrong for something he was criticizing.
He's
And
getting better at it. He's
all
getting
right.
better. I got one trenchant comment in our
Yes, let's
feed.
hear it.
It was, "Such handsome boys," and the commenter was Francis V. Jalamas, age 88 years old.
Such handsome boys, such young whippersnappers.
Do you have a head quake for the week?
Well, headquake. Oh, I
I do.
didn't. Yes, let's hear yours because I don't have one this week.
My head quake was a post by Senator Cory Booker yesterday. It was multiple edits of presidents or presidential candidates speaking to each other in a highly collegial manner. One was Romney and Obama in their first debate. The other was all the presidents, George W. Bush ushering in the new President Obama with other presidents at his side. And most telling, I think, is a famous one by John McCain answering a question from a town hall where someone said they were afraid of Obama.
Yes,
And you might remember that his
do
saying,
remember this.
he's a decent man. And a woman yelled out and said, he's a Muslim. He said, no, he's not a Muslim. He's a decent family man. and he's someone that I disagree with. And
Those were the
it makes
days.
it makes you love John McCain, except for one little thing.
Yeah,
It sounds
yeah.
rich coming from him
No,
because he's
absolutely.
the one who unleashed the Sarah Palin genie. And you could
Yes.
argue that unleashed, back to the beginning of our conversation, unleashed the MAGA movement
Yeah,
and
yeah, the
sorry,
Tea Party
the Tea
movement.
Party
Tea
movement
Party,
and the
yes.
MAGA movement.
Well, he was a multifaceted figure. He was a war hero, which, Trump, denigrated. A lot of these people look better in retrospect. Everyone looks better compared to Trump in retrospect. George W. Bush, who I couldn't stand at the time, is looking better in retrospect. But anyway, that's a whole other conversation. This has been a good discussion, Jim, and I applaud your continued appearance at rallies and demonstrations. And how sorry
Oh, I thank you
protests.
very much.
Yes, you're doing the right stuff. Well, listen, that's thanks you for everyone for tuning in. I'm JB Miller in London,
I'm Jim Jalamas, back in Brooklyn.
back in Brooklyn. All right, see you guys soon. Bye.
Okay, good morning and good night.